Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our second episode of Heating Up, a safe space to talk sex ed. In case this is your first time tuning into us, I'm just gonna briefly reintroduce myself. And I'm actually going to give a little bit of a longer description of myself this time than last time to acknowledge some of my identities and my positionality as we go into today's topic. So just as a reminder, my name's Jianna. I also go by Jay. It's usually just a little easier for folks to get the first letter of my name, and it's turned into an endearing nickname for myself. So feel free to refer to me with either. I am a working class young person. I'm able-bodied and I'm white. So I just wanted to share those parts of myself with you as we move forward through today. And today's episode is entitled, What We Think We Know, Cultural Taboos About Sex. And I think that this topic is a really important one to discuss at the very beginning of the 10-week or the 10-episode podcast we have envisioned for right now. I think, starting off with last week's material, which was a very brief and overview discussion of what sex is and explaining some definitions so that we all kind of approach what our notion of sex is in a somewhat similar way moving forward, so that we have a common groundwork to be able to build off of over the next few episodes that we'll release. And in that same vein of trying to build a really steady foundation for the topics that we'll discuss later, I thought that the immediate next episode should have been a kind of cultural situation of sex and understanding the impact that our social structures have on our own sexual development. So with that being said, I do have slides this time. They're very brief. There's like hardly any text on them, but just in case some folks are more visual learners, we thought this would be a good component to add. So I'm just going to be moving through them and explaining some really vague but large concepts that exist in the realm of this conversation that we're going to have today. So I wanted to highlight first the term intersectionality and what it means, and the reason that it's present in our conversation today. Intersectionality is a topic that was touched on last week as well, but I figured now would be a really good time to further delve into the term a bit deeper and with a bit more care than we did a couple weeks ago. So with that said, intersectionality was first introduced as or at least was first named as intersectionality by activist Kimberly Crenshaw, and that's who you see here pictured. She coined the term intersectionality to explain how our different identities exist within us. And so this notion of intersectionality explains that no part of our identities exist in isolation within our experience. So with that being said, and especially tying it back to sexuality, intersectionality speaks on how our sexual orientation doesn't exist as an isolated part of who we are. And so instead, our sexual development happens alongside all of these other really important aspects of who we are and really form it into what it becomes over our lifespan. And so this notion of intersectionality really explains how these different aspects of our identities all intersect with one another and they all play into one another. They're constantly working with each other and molding our experiences to be really unique to us and the communities that we're a part of. So it's important to acknowledge this intersectionality to understand that our experiences in our sexual development's not going to be a blanketed experience that everybody is going to have in the same way. And so this ties back into what we were talking about a couple weeks ago when we were talking about how everybody has their own definition of sex. Typically when, we're thinking of what behaviors might classify as what we consider to be sex, those perspectives are going to be affected by all the different parts of our identities as well, not just our sexuality. And so with that idea of how multidimensional our experiences are, especially in relation to our sexuality, I wanted to also briefly touch on this concept that exists within science of objectivity and a universal truth, and kind of situating that more so in this idea of cultural relativism. So those sound like really big words, and if you've never heard of them before, that's okay. It's jargon used mostly in academic spaces, but they're themes that are salient in our everyday lives, which is why I wanted to bring it up today and hopefully break down these ideas in a way that's more digestible. The person pictured on the screen here is Oyeyumi. She is a Nigerian professor, and her work, The Invention of Women, was written in 1997 or 1998, I believe. And it was this work that I read that really situated these ideas in a way that resonated with me. And so that's why I wanted to include her picture and pay homage to her. Without her work, I wouldn't have the grasp on these ideas that I do. And so her work is a really great example of Pan-African feminism that situates ideas that we mistake as universal in the US and kind of situate them more in a global context. And so her work really explains how science oftentimes promotes this idea of objectivity and of concrete scientific findings that are always factual. And this is a really important notion, and scientific discovery and empirical evidence are all really important tenets of the health education models that we should be using in order to discuss things like sex. But sometimes we can get so hung up on that idea that we forget that there's a lot of different perspectives and realities out there, and that ours aren't necessarily as objective or as universal as we might think that they are. And so we see this within sex and sexuality in a lot of different ways. Her book, specifically The Invention of Women, discusses this idea as it relates to feminism and as it relates to the idea of the patriarchy. And so to kind of situate it more in that example, her work really just explains how, our experience with the patriarchy in the United States is not the same existence of the patriarchy that exists throughout the globe, and pushes it beyond that to even recognize that the patriarchy itself is not a global concept. It doesn't even exist everywhere. And so it's those kinds of notions of understanding how these tenets of our society that we think are so concrete don't exist everywhere and don't exist in the same way for different people. And so that's where this idea of cultural relativism comes in. And that notion explains how we have to understand that our scientific knowledge is situated within our culture and the dominant social narratives that exist in our society at that moment in time. And so once we understand this, we can really delve more into these topics of sexuality that we're going to discuss throughout the rest of the podcast with a little bit more care and a little bit of a deeper analysis than we might if we didn't ground ourselves in these ideas, which is what I think is really important and what I wanted to highlight today. So moving forward through these ideas, I wanted to talk about how sexuality and gender exist as social constructions. And while they might have components to them that seem biological, they really exist within the United States and within these kinds of conversations as social constructions. And what that means is that our sexuality and our gender are these ideas that we have crafted and that we as a society have built into what they exist today. And so really in understanding this, we can think a little bit more about how, we as humans have a tendency to invent certain things and construct them into these ideas and then place them as permanent fixtures of our society when in reality they're not. And so I think this is really important so that we can move through the rest of our topics, and especially the next topic we'll have in a couple weeks from now that's going to explore LGBTQ plus identity in a way that really honors people's experiences rather than trying to tie these identities or these experiences to these objective truths that we understand now are a little bit more malleable than we might have thought. And so this person that I have pictured on the screen's name is Alok Menon, and they are a non-binary activist that are, through their work in both poetry and art and fashion, they try to explain their sexuality and their gender and their experiences as it exists within this social constructionist framework. So wanted to throw that in there, especially to kind of prepare us for the topic that we'll be talking about in 2 weeks, like I mentioned, all about LGBTQ identities and exploring those themes a little bit more in depth as well. And then, for instance, I wanted to talk about 2 specific experiences that I think really will hopefully serve as more of a concrete understanding of the topics that we just mentioned, especially because they exist a little bit more abstractly. I wanted to tie it back to these identities that really showcase, that notion of intersectionality and understanding how our cultures impact our identity. And so with that, I wanted to just kind of point everybody in the direction of more resources and further education. Again, just really acknowledging my whiteness and understanding how the current constructions of sexuality and gender are really have been created by and made for people like me and tend to further marginalize these intersectional identities that don't have the same place in our common notions of gender and sexuality as mine might. So with that said, I wanted to show this video. It's all about Two-Spirit identity as it exists in Indigenous culture. So I'll just kind of give a brief overview, and then folks will be able to access this video on their own afterwards if they want to further understand and further expand upon their education. So in Indigenous and First Nation cultures, the idea of a gender binary doesn't exist in the same way as it does for us. And so the gender binary is this idea that gender exists solely as either being a man or a woman. And rooting this in LGBTQ identity, we know that that's not the case, but that is still a really dominant tenet that a lot of people hold for their ideas about gender. But what I think is important to tie into what we're talking about right now and our current conversation is how that exists as a very Western idea, and how European and US colonialism have crafted that idea of the gender binary as a way to further other the people that they were discriminating against. And so that's really exemplified in the erasure of Two-Spirit identity as it exists for Indigenous peoples. And the Two-Spirit identity speaks on how Indigenous cultures view gender as these both masculine and feminine energies and forces that we all have present within us. And so this Two-Spirit identity exists for Indigenous people who identify with both the masculine and feminine energy that they feel they embody as a person. And so this idea of a very culturally grounded gender identity really speaks on the ideas that we talked about earlier about how every part of who we are exists as a whole rather than as isolated components of us, which brings home that idea of intersectionality. And it also brings back that idea of universal truths not being as apparent as we once might have thought, and instead understanding that with different cultures brings different experiences that craft our sexuality and our gender in ways that are unique to us, unique to our culture, and unique to other parts of our identity. And so along with Indigenous Two-Spirit folks, I also wanted to touch on, I think the video might play, but I'm just going to pause it real quick and move to the next slide. Like I said, you folks can watch it. It'll be provided for you. So you can watch it on your own time if you'd like. And so in conjunction with that identity of Indigenous Two-Spirit folks, I also wanted to talk about Black lesbian identity. The person that you see pictured here is Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore is a Black lesbian scholar who wrote this book I also really love and has really been formative for me in my education. And it's called Invisible Families. It's all about Black lesbian identity and situating the very intersectional and unique experience of being or identifying as Black and being a lesbian as this really unique experience. And so Dr. Moore's work talks about how Black women come into their lesbian identity in very cultural spaces, and in doing so they hold their Blackness as a tenet of their sexuality, and a lot of the ways in which they demonstrate their sexuality and build relationships and navigate motherhood is all rooted in their experience as Black women. And so this also ties into all of the ideas that we've been mentioning so far and trying our best to explain, which is that notion of intersectionality and how all of our components make up us as a whole, and how all of our identities are going to develop alongside and playing along one another, and that they don't exist as isolated topics or parts of who we are. And this Black lesbian identity, and specifically Dr. Moore's work explaining how that exists culturally, also goes into that idea of cultural relativism and how lesbian identity and sexual development exists within cultural spaces for Black women specifically in this country. And so it's really nice to see Dr. Moore's work and her family. She has a really great interview on YouTube that's available as well. If you folks would like to watch that when you're watching the other YouTube video, it could be provided as well. And so I really wanted to highlight Dr. Moore and her work in explaining how all of these cultural influences really impact our sexuality, and how it's important to explain these concepts as early as possible so that we can ground ourselves in the presence that our cultural identities have on our sexuality. And it wouldn't really be very thorough or very comprehensive sex ed if it wasn't inclusive of these ideas and really bringing forth the importance of highlighting and centering marginalized experiences, especially. And so at this point of the episode is when I was going to bring in a friend of mine who identifies as a Black non-binary lesbian, and we were going to discuss much more personally and in much more depth how cultural influences have impacted their sexual and gender development. Like I said, something I wanted to be very forthcoming about with this episode is that this is the work that I think should be taken on by white folks in sex education, just because it's not the responsibility of people of color or people with these unique experiences to have to educate everybody else on them. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge how my whiteness is a really heavy part of who I am and impacts my education and my perspective on these things, and that it's really important to hear from folks who experience them firsthand rather than just me trying to explain the concepts to you as I've learned them. So unfortunately, however, they could not be here tonight due to a family emergency. So instead, we're going to be recording a conversation that we were going to be having here instead and posting them as a video for you guys to be able to watch at a later time whenever it's convenient for you. And so be on the lookout for that. I'm really excited for the kinds of conversation that we're going to have. It's definitely a conversation that we've had casually before. I really enjoy and also encourage you all to talk to your friends about those parts of who they are and really get to know them for every piece of them, and learn and grow from your friends as much as you enjoy their company as well. And so I'm really lucky that I have a lot of folks in my life that I'm able to share those experiences with. And so I'm really looking forward to that conversation, and not just having it, but in sharing it with you all as well. And so please be on the lookout for that. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. And I hope to see you folks on the next episode. I've mentioned already a couple times throughout tonight that it is going to center LGBTQ plus identity. And so I'm really excited to take that on. I identify as queer myself, so I am excited to share some personal experiences with you all as well, and really continue to get to know each other, but also build our ideas of sexuality and of gender, and really foster this space of learning together. So with that, I hope I'll see you on March 16th at 7 p.m. on the same Facebook Live link as always. And I hope you guys enjoy a spring break if you're getting it. I know mine's next week and I'm excited. So I'll see you folks just after that, March 16th at 7. Thank you so much for listening.